Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and today we have a special treat. My friend Joanna Meyer is on the podcast. Joanna, welcome.
Hi, it's so great to be here.
I'm so glad you can be here with me today. This fall, we're talking to a number of local authors who are also our friends, and I'm delighted to be able to have you on the podcast today as both a local author and my friend.
Yay, so fun.
Joanna, we are going to talk about a book that you released. When did this come out?
This came out October 2023.
Okay, so October 2023, so almost a year from when this conversation will be released on the podcast. And the title of the book is Women, Work, and Calling, Step into Your Place in God's World. But before we jump into talking more about the book, how it came to be, and the content in the book, I wanted to ask you just to introduce yourself. Some of our listeners may know you, but many probably don't.
Yeah.
So what would you like to share with us to get to know you a little bit?
Well, hi, friends. I am a member here at Fellowship Denver Church, have been for a number of years. I have spent the last decade working at the Denver Institute for Faith and Work, which is a local independent nonprofit that helps people think about how their daily work is part of life with God and serving others. And as part of that, I founded Women, Work, and Calling, which is a national initiative that disciples women, Christian women, for influence in public life. And so it's just been really fun. I live here in the Denver area. I'm a long-term Coloradan, proud parent of Denver's cutest gray rabbit, a little bunny named Billy.
He is very cute.
He is very cute. And yeah, single, fun. Yeah, enjoy life in Denver and love my work.
So I want to point out, you mentioned that you lead this initiative that's called Women, Work, and Calling, which is the same as the name of the book. So
and an annual event. We really are creative in our naming, right?
No, I think it's awesome that they all are tied together because they all are speaking to the same sorts of things, addressing the same topics. One thing I was curious about, and now that I have you here captive on the podcast, was about how this book came to be. So you mentioned you worked for the Denver Institute for Faith and Work for many years. The initiative, the Women, Work, and Calling initiative that you now lead, grew up kind of alongside your work there. And now you've written this book called Women, Work, and Calling. And I love books. That's not a shock to anyone listening to the podcast. But books are many things all at once. They are art in the sense that they're someone's expression put into writing. They are information, their story, all bound up together. And so I often see books I envision them as having a sort of life cycle. So what was the life cycle of this book? How did it come to be?
Yeah, we have been leading programming for women since about 2014. We hosted our first Women, Work, and Calling event because at that time we sensed that women were facing kind of the work and home life tension. The conversation started there, like, does our work outside the home matter? It was very, kind of 101 level. And we saw that there was a huge hunger to talk about it. It revealed that there was a much broader and richer conversation to be had. And so over the last 8 to 10 years, I've been thinking about that. Like, what are we seeing when it comes to discipling Christian women for all of life? And we realize there's a huge gap there. There's wonderful work being done in helping women understand Scripture, having spiritual disciplines, enriching our relationships, whether it's friendships or family roles. But there's a huge gap in speaking to women's roles in public life. And those might be paid positions. They might be volunteer roles. You could be a stay-at-home mom and be ruling your local PTA, and you're having significant influence that needs to be stewarded. So we saw that gap there, that there was both a lack of biblical and theological framework. There's a lack of community of women talking with each other about it. And there was a lack of tools for local churches or anyone in a role where they were forming Christian women for mission. There just wasn't anything to help them. And so as our local programming, this annual event kept rolling on, we realized that we wanted to create a tool. And we also wanted to create a tool that was accessible. Often the faith and work conversation can be very heady. You're talking about Calvin or, the fathers of the church and things like that. It's just not accessible. And we know that women are super busy. So the book is designed to be small, accessible, practical, really something that women can get into their hands and into conversation with each other. And so the book has grown out of both the amazing conversations we've been hosting with women and key leaders, women leading across industries, and our desire to make this conversation more accessible and more broadly distributed for women.
I've heard you mention at times, Joanna, you bring this out in the book, but I've heard you mention it in conversation as well, that this book is something of a collaboration. As you've hosted this annual event, Women Work in Calling, and then began to host sort of forums or gatherings for leaders in various sectors of the economy here in Denver as well, I know you've said that listening to those women speak, listening to the conversations that are being had, all of that fed into this book, what it ultimately became. But it grew up out of your own story and your own experience as well. And you have been the one leading this initiative. So what in your own story sparked this book?
This would be a challenge for any woman or man who might be listening today, is to consider your own vocational autobiography. What are the key influences and factors that have shaped how you see your gifts and talents and place in the world? How does that shape your understanding of vocation, which is just a fancy word of saying calling? And so for me to sit with my own vocational autobiography, you can't deny that this work has come from who God has made me to be. And we often, as we talk about calling at Denver Institute, we often say that we are formed for our call and it's not something we find as much. It's not something you have to go digging for in like a needle in a haystack. And so I look at my own life and how God has shaped me for the reality of what this work is. Some of it comes from my life stage. Like, I happen to be a single woman. I mentioned that earlier. And so work has had to play a significant role in my life for financial needs. Like, not working has not been an option. And so in situations where we hold out a binary for women, sometimes in church culture, it's easy to do that. We imply like you have a life at home and you have a life in public. Like, I've had to blend those two just because of the reality of being a single person. I also have leadership gifts and vision. And so it has been hard for me at times in church settings to know what to do with myself. And there are a lot of women in different stages of life or different gifts who feel like they don't quite fit the mold, whether it was overtly offered them or it was just subtle as in the culture and the water they were swimming in. When you don't fit the mold, you need to find answers. And I was hungry for a richer and broader story for how to steward my life. And that is part of the vision and passion that I bring to Women Work in Calling. Is I want any woman in any life stage or generation or place in the world to have some tools to help her live into the fullness of who God has made her to be.
What you're describing there is actually in the subtitle of the book. It says, step into your place in God's world. So a way that you're saying that this is reflective of your own personal story is that God is forming you and shaping you into doing exactly that. That as you have taken up the work at Denver Institute for Faith and Work, thought more deeply about theology of work and then women's work in particular, and then how this is really a really present reality in your own life. And how then Scripture speaks into all of that and helps us see meaning and purpose in it. That you are pursuing God to do exactly that in your own life, to step into the place that God has for you.
Part of this is helping myths that we have about calling. Often we think that calling is something that God declares for our forward direction. And the reality is, at its core, biblically, calling is a whole life response to God's invitation. So it's an invitation to personal salvation, to life with Him, and it's an invitation to live in His renewing work and mission in the world. And so every one of us is figuring out, how do I best steward the mix of situations and gifts that God has given me? How do I address the brokenness that I see in my life and the community around me? How do I amplify the goodness and the beauty and the truth of God? And so calling is much more of a daily experiment and journey with God. In knowing that our foundational relationship with Him is established, that gives us courage to be entrepreneurial about our lives. And that's something I want to invite more people, both men and women, into. And I think there's just a lot of cultural baggage for women that can hold us back from really having the confidence to live that way.
Yeah, definitely. As you were writing the book, what parts of it were challenging for you to write? Either because what you were saying was actually challenging to you in that season, or because you wanted to really make sure that you were being understood in what you were saying?
Probably two things. One, just personally, as I have opportunities to talk about the book, I realize I'm still growing in almost every area of these topics. I don't want to imply that I'm an expert. We were talking before we hit record about all the ways we're still growing in these themes. So I'm still a work in progress on so many of the themes that we cover in the book.
And that calling that you just described is continual.
Yeah.
It's a continual
freedom in
following
that.
after. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'm doing some teaching later today for a group of women's ministry leaders from around the country. And at the core of what we're talking about is the idea of having a bigger view of the gospel than it's often been presented to us. So often we see the gospel as two chapters. It's sin and salvation. This is the reality that separates us from God. Through Christ, we're restored to relationship with him. But the reality is the gospel is a lot broader than that. It actually stretches across the entire story of Scripture. I would like to argue it's a 4-chapter thing where it's creation, fall, redemption through Christ, and restoration in the future of the new heavens and the new earth. And I think women have not been invited to step into that story. They maybe have never heard it before, or they haven't seen the full scope of their life. Women are working more than ever before, like the Labor Department statistics are showing that. But we haven't been invited to connect that to and those two realities of this broad story of God at work in all of history with the reality of me working, or an average woman working at Wells Fargo Bank on the other side of town. And so when you invite men and women into that story, but especially women, like, it energizes our lives. It gives us a new imagination, a new commitment to the stewardship of our gifts and the juggling of the realities that is their lives. And so that's a real hunger I have in that, offering a broader theological framework with practical tools and community and inspiration, that we would see women like really live into the edges, the full picture of the gospel and what it means for them.
Yeah, you're picking up on something there that I think is, as I've read the book and thought about this now, much of the reason that I've thought about women work and calling is because of your work.
I
because
love
of hearing you teach about it.
That makes me so glad.
Because of hearing you teach about it years ago at a women's event on theology of work and talking about women's work. And that certainly sparked something in my mind. But that began my thinking deeply now for years about this whole aspect of work. And one reality that you just mentioned a moment ago is that so many more women do work now outside the home. So work includes this full scope for women and men of what we do in the home and outside the home. But many women now work outside the home.
77% of American women, the Labor Department says.
That's so
the highest numbers
high.
ever, either part-time or beyond.
Yes. And so you identified this gap. So I wonder if you could speak to two gaps. The first is one you've already mentioned. There's this gap between the fact that so many women are working outside the home, but we don't have good tools within the church to disciple women in the area of work. That's probably true of men's work too.
Yeah.
We probably fall short in discipling people in this area of vocation and work. And then the other gap I wonder if you could speak to is the gap between men and women's work. Because this book is specifically entitled Women, Work, and Calling, but some of the things that it's addressing, I'm sure men experience as well. Yeah. So how are you envisioning that as you put together the content for the book?
Yeah, let's talk faith work gap, and then we'll talk about kind of genders and how we engage it. But the faith work gap is real, and it really asks any of us that are in positions of ministry leadership to really think deeply about what does it look like to disciple people for all of life. And it's hard. I think we have models of doing church that can be additive, and by that I mean we say, if you're going to be faithful, you need to do this. Number one, you need to do number two, number three, number four, Sunday service, small group, volunteering, mentoring, pursuit night. Like, you can name a bunch. In any particular local church, you could go into and say, like, how are we approaching this? And we treat our working hours as if they exist apart from the work of the church. And so faithfulness is adding on in whatever free time you have left. And it can be exhausting. I'm sitting here with the two of you who are recording, with Jesse, who's running our tech, and with you, who's interviewing me. And I know how busy your lives are with kids. Like, you live very hectic lives. And so it's hard to treat faithfulness as if it's something that has to be added on to already full schedules. We need to have a vision that speaks into all of life. like the name of this podcast. But that means that we speak into the reality of the 90,000 hours that the average worker will spend engaged in work over a lifetime. We also need to help them understand both God is present with them and is shaping their souls, that work is formational in our spiritual journey, that the life of faithfulness flows through that, but also that mission flows through our daily work, which means we disciple people for their work. That's regardless of your gender. It's different to disciple people for work, of figuring out both how is God shaping you there, but also how are you shaping the work itself? Like, how are you having an imagination for how you could engage God's renewal of all things through the unique sphere of the world that God has entrusted to you? So that's that theological gap, is helping people bridge that. And what is so fun about that is that when people get this big vision of the gospel and begin to see their daily work and sphere of influence as deeply godly, amazing things come out of it. And their own faith gains new energy and new scope because of that. So that's a fun journey for people to take. And that's why Denver Institute and so many faith and work organizations exist. Regarding the gender piece, the way that women and men experience their gender is incredibly diverse. It's dependent on our generation, the denominational faith background you grew up in, the region of the country you grew up in, your own family history, your ethnicity, your class. All of that goes into your understanding of who you are and what it means to be a woman or a man, and a Christian woman or a man. So I want to make sure we're not only dwelling in stereotypes, but humor me for a second if I do. But one of the challenges, I think, for Christian women of this cultural moment is that we've either had overt or covert messaging about what it means to be a woman of God. I think of my age, I was raised in the 80s. And so there were certain kind of organizations that were huge in teaching Christian families what it meant to be godly families. And so a lot of messaging went towards women being at home. And that was my demographic: white, middle class, educated family, listening to focus on the family. And so there's a lot of overt messaging that if you care about your kids, mom is going to be at home. And there was a suspicion. It was an either or proposition. If you were working, you were putting your family at risk. That was very generational. And that's not the story that everyone has, but some women will have that. And I found that after even teaching here at Fellowship years later, a woman grabbed me in the lobby on Easter of all things and said, "Hey, I've never had a chance to tell you this, but that lesson that you taught to the women's group about work so many years ago," she goes, "it was kind of life-changing," because she had been raised in a culture where she felt a lot of guilt about working, and financially her family needed to do that. And so she lacked this bigger vision of how work can be a good and godly integrated thing in her life. And she had a lot of cultural messaging that created this inner churn in her life. Now, it plays differently for everyone. Not everyone has that same baggage. Also, when we aren't teaching a proactive message that is this broad vision of calling and an integrated life, the gap speaks loudly. So if you're in a situation as a woman where the only messaging you're getting is about your personal spiritual disciplines or enriching your relational roles as a wife or a mother or neighbor, it kind of feels like the rest of your life is less important. And so women working calling is filling that gap in helping women integrate their lives, stopping this hierarchy of roles of what's more important to God, or this either or thinking about, you can't care about both, and inviting women to step into the very real tension of integrating our roles. I'm not going to make it sound like it's easy, but what a beautiful place to live with God, of saying, "God, help me become a steward of all that you've given me and all that I can do with you and for you."
I have found that term integration to be so helpful. So often we talk about work, especially as women, in the context of kind of different buckets or juggling things. You hear that a lot, or trying to strike some sort of balance, which always seems impossible, between these various realms that you move between. And in many ways, the disintegration that we experience is because of our modern cultural pressure. And so there is an extent to which when I go to work, I'm at work, and when I go home, I'm specifically with my children. But the understanding of integration, and especially faith integrating into all of those areas, and that even though I may function in a certain way while I'm at work and function differently while I'm at home, that the solidity and identity in Christ and this vision for vocation carries through all of those things. That has been so helpful
and
for
that
me
the
to
work matters.
understand. Yes.
That it's not a secondary. It's not secondary. It's stewarding all of the responsibilities that we've given. And we forget sometimes, or we miss just how strong the cultural messaging is. Like I was talking to a new acquaintance, and she's talking about her teenage child. And she said, it's the most important thing I'll ever do. And I didn't push back on her, but I'm like, hey, the most important thing you'll ever do is walk with God. And he's entrusted you with a parenting relationship. And so that's deeply meaningful. But when your whole life is stewarded, we're not going to create this false hierarchy of saying like, oh, parenting is the most important thing. Because think about me as a single woman who has struggled with the reality of not being able to kids. You've been my friends for years, so you know this has been a journey for my own life. Like, just think about like that messaging doesn't hold true for my life. Like, if parenting is the most important thing you'll ever do, what do you do to somebody who's unable to be a parent like me? Like, I go, that a loving God doesn't do that. A loving God says all of the roles that we fill are meaningful and asks us to live with him in all of them. There's something freeing to that, but we have to kind of get at the cultural messaging that we have around it too. And I don't think that diminishes parenthood at all.
Yes,
it just situates it in a broader framework.
Yes, absolutely. It is incredibly important, but it doesn't have to be stacked up necessarily against the other roles.
Yeah, they're not in competition to each other.
But what has the reception, Joanna, been from the men who have read this book? What kind of conversations has that sparked?
Yeah, it's been fascinating to see because men will read the book and say, well, about 90% of it related to me. And that's reflective of the need for discipleship for men and women around this integrated vision of calling and the missional value of work. So I would say, yeah, this does relate to you. The reality is faith communities are not having this conversation with women. And I think it comes from what I alluded to. Like, we have some deep grooves in what it looks like to disciple women. We lack tools to know how to do it. And there are some unique nuances that come from gender, in which this book is designed to be a conversation starter. It's not encyclopedic. It's not going to answer, a friend said, you could write a full-length chapter on each of the discussion points that you have in this book. And that's not what it was intended to do. It's a framework and a starter. But we want to see that, that go from there. And there are some distinct nuances, challenges that women feel.
When you say it's a framework and a conversation starter, I can see that readily in the book, in the way it's put together. It's short.
Yeah, it's a short little book.
It's easy to read. It's easy to work through with someone else. There's a section at the end of each chapter that's a reflection section with some questions to help generate conversation around the topics, which also are presented in a short format so that it's easy to read and then converse about. So how are you seeing this book being used, or how would you suggest people think about it as a framework for conversation? What are the contexts?
It's been so fun. I keep hearing of stories where the book is popping up around the country where I haven't had any connection to the people reading it, which is really encouraging. It is designed to be conversational. So an individual woman will read and benefit. The discussion questions could be journaled at the end. You could make it your personal devotion over the course of the summer, which would be exciting. Or maybe you're a woman who has desired to invest in younger women who are in your community. This is a powerful book that you can use in an informal mentoring relationship. Host a book club and read it together, or read it with your book clubs, or use it with your women's group at church. When we think about the resources that we're designing for women working calling these days, we're designing everything we produce to be transferable. That could be used in a variety of contexts. That is filling that gap by going out and helping women take these concepts and use them in their own context, which is really fun. And, if you want to do a book club, we have a free digital discussion guide at womenworkingcalling.com that you can download. The book is pretty easy to facilitate, but you could do it in 2 sessions. You could do it in 4. It's really easy.
It is divided into 4 sections. So if you were setting it up that way to discuss one of those sections in the course of 4 meetings, I could see how that would work really well. Recently, So I guess it's been a little bit, but after the book launched and you were posting about it, sharing about it on social media, I saw you share one post about a man who was doing this with his daughters who were all older. They were in the workforce. And it was such a sweet example of using this as a tool to generate conversation in a way that I wouldn't have initially thought about.
Yeah, it's been fun to see men engage the book. So my friend Kevin Colon, who's a father of 4 daughters, 3 of whom are early career, so they just finishing college and starting jobs. He did a book club with them, and it was a wonderful tool for him to listen. What I love is it invited him into deeper relationship with his daughters and put him in a posture of listening. I also think of 2 podcast hosts I talked to recently who both have wives who really love their careers, and so they had their wives read the book and highlight it, and they followed up and read it before the interview. And they said they learned a lot about what their wives were thinking by seeing the notes that the wives had made as they read the book. And I thought, isn't that wonderful? Like, what if we had richer dialogue between men and women about these themes?
Well, let's talk about the content of the book a little bit. It covers much of what we've already been discussing, this discipleship gap, the way women experience work, the pressures that women face in work. But it starts with a big vision for work. This is something that I love about listening to you teach, about thinking about this whole conversation, is that you have gotten very good, Joanna, at talking about theology and work and igniting our vocational imagination. And so I love that you start the book that way. And so the first section of the book is called Ignite Your Vocational Imagination. And we mentioned a moment ago that so many women in our context here in the workforce. And this is pretty distinctly different from, I think, eras past, pre-industrial revolution, certainly, but also different from the era when Scripture was written. And yet Scripture is rich with pictures of work and workers and has so much to say that still can ignite our vocational imagination. So why did you choose to start the book there? And what do you hope people start thinking about by engaging that first section of the book?
Yeah, it's funny how we will camp out in certain stories of women in Scripture that aren't reflective of the whole. And so we're always served when we look at the whole counsel of Scripture. And so this big vision of that 4-chapter gospel of like situating the death and resurrection of Christ as the hinge point in human history, but that it's not just personal, it's cosmic in scope. Suddenly you realize like, oh, I need to have a vision of life with God that speaks to the cosmic nature of the gospel. To me, it's interesting. So I'm leading a ministry leaders intensive this afternoon. We're kicking off, and I asked the women, can you explain to me what the gospel is? That was like a application question. And of the 21 women in the program, all 21 said the gospel is personal. This is about my personal salvation and relationship with Christ. And I was like, oh, they're going to learn. We're going to learn that today that the gospel is the hinge point of all of history. It is, you know, John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world, and the roots of that world are cosmos. And there are a number of examples in the New Testament where it says God is at work in the world, and he's saying the cosmos. And so when we shift it out of just being personal, it's not limited. It starts there and it flows out to the corners of creation. When we live in that, suddenly we realize, oh, like the gospel is both intimate and it is immense. And so all of my life is lived in the reality of God who's broken the power of sin, who has a vision for life and flourishing. And so the opening chapter of the book invites readers to sit with that reality. Both our identity as being made in the image of God, of workers, of the goodness of work, of culture making, but also that engagement of being people of godly change in the world. In any corner of it depends on the scope of what God's entrusted to us. But all of us can bring life to others through the way that we work. And so the book really invites people to sit with that, both men and women alike. And it reminds us that men and women are a dynamic pairing, that when God designed humanity, he intended us to be doing this amazing work, both as culture makers in the Garden of Eden, tending and caring for it, and as agents of flourishing and renewal as we live in the reality of a risen Christ. We do that together with men and women. And so that's how the book is situated, in this immensity of the gospel and also the unique pairing of men and women together.
The gospel provides us with this integrated vision for work in the way that all of life can be a stewardship, and in this particular way that you're talking about, the vision for men and women working together to bring about flourishing in God's world.
Yeah. I love, one of my favorite authors is Carolyn Custis James, and she calls that pairing a blessed alliance. That when God was designing the team that he put together to steward this amazing work that he's given us to do, he put men and women together as a pair.
That integrated vision of the gospel, you used the term earlier, Joanna, creates a generous conversation around this topic as well. So in what you just described, you gave a picture of work of all kinds being really important in this work of stewardship. So work of men and women together in the way that God created them, which calls to mind this vision in creation and then helps us look forward to the cosmic reality of the realization of the gospel and the work of God in the world, and a generous conversation in that you've said it doesn't elevate certain kinds of work over others.
Yeah. People will often ask in the broader programming of women work and calling, like, who's the right fit for it? And I often say it's a woman that is asking questions about how to steward her influence. So she's thinking about her leadership, her gifts, the way that she engages the world. You know, there could be a woman that has a really fast-growing career that isn't asking those questions. And so she's going to be bored out of her mind in this conversation. Or I think of a friend of mine, Ingrid, who used to live here in the Denver area, was retired, and she saw herself living in her neighborhood as having a ministry of presence and of insight and encouragement. And so we used to joke that she was the mayor of Perry Street. She lived up in the Highlands. And even though she didn't have a paid job, she was stewarding her relational influence as a neighbor in all of the ways she engaged the folks in the Highlands neighborhood that she lived in. So she'd be a welcome person in this conversation. So that's where the generosity comes from. There's a generosity towards men, that men are always welcome in this conversation. They're not the primary audience, and yet they're vital participants in what we're doing. And so we always want them to feel welcome. We're not bashing men. And I have to watch that sometimes. You know, I can get frustrated and my tone can be less than honoring. But I have people that hold me accountable to really setting that generous tone.
The second section of the book is called Build Strength from Within. So it includes 5 short chapters, but they're all grouped under this heading. And I wanted to share with you that there were a couple of chapters in that section that really struck a chord with me. There are the 2 sections that are entitled Cultivate Humble Confidence and Overcome Imposter Syndrome. And as I read through them, I thought, yes, this resonates. And I do find these particular aspects of work challenging. And particularly as a woman in a leadership role in a ministerial setting, I can struggle with these 2 aspects of work and my presence in my work repeatedly. I wouldn't say it's constant, but it's cyclical. They come up for me over and over again. And you included them in the book, so I'm assuming that this is a theme you've heard from other women as well.
And men, the irony, you know, men struggle with it. But yes, these 2 themes in particular, I think, are ones that women wrestle with, of how do I uniquely display confidence in my ideas and my leadership in a way that, I use the word authentic, that feels right for who I am as a woman, that also is rightly situated. And it's hard to put that word humble on it, because I think sometimes women just need to be bold in their confidence. But I do think there's a beautiful picture of life in Christ, that we don't have to over-exert ourselves. We don't have to assume a posture that's inauthentic. And that's a challenge. I think that was reflective of modern workplace dynamics that, I'm going to dwell on stereotypes for a second, so just humor me here. Often we can see leadership coming in a masculine package. And so as women, we may think, well, I need to be effective as a leader, that's what I need to look like. Or for men, we may see effective leadership as only looking and sounding male, because that's what we're most familiar with. And so the humility, the confidence, the imposter syndrome of adopting a persona that's not true, or not believing that we are capable of the situation, all kind of flows from that, of not seeing examples of feminine leadership in the same proportion as men, and not digging in and acknowledging some of the stereotypes or bias that we might have about what effective leadership looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think our cultural conditioning often kind of, if you're a woman in a corporate setting who has the opportunity to rise within that organization, or who works at a very high level, or who leads, even if it's not in a paid way, but leads at a high level in a particular context, the examples that were given from culture, post-industrial revolution and then post-sexual revolution, often kind of compel us to say, if you're going to exist in these spaces, then you need to have these qualities, which are more typically masculine qualities. And so you can definitely feel that you have to exert those qualities or put on a certain type of persona to be present in some of those spaces.
It's weird because academic research shows that women that are expected, there can be a subtle pressure for women to adopt a more masculine persona in their leadership. But unfortunately, when women act outside of the stereotypical type of being a woman in the workplace, they can be viewed harshly. So, for example, in a performance review, your feedback may be, you need to be more assertive in how you communicate. But when a woman does, what's viewed as assertiveness in a man is aggressiveness in a woman. Or, well, you could call her the B word, which has been heard many times in corporate, behind closed doors in corporate settings. And so there is a real dance. And I think that's a place of discernment and growth and coaching as women that we can continue to figure out how we navigate that balance.
And you take that on specifically in the third section of the book that is called Navigate Common Workplace Challenges. There's a section in there about the double bind, which is what you're describing. Yep. How could we as women continue to cultivate humble confidence? I love that phrase, and I would suggest to our listeners that they read the book, and you can read more about it in the chapter that covers it. But what would you say to our women listening? We've identified the issue here, and I kind of don't want to just leave it hanging on the problem.
Yeah. I think, a couple ideas come to mind. One relates to how you engage social media, and one relates to knowing yourself and how you communicate and present in the world. So, a first tip is getting a healthy relationship to social media, because, that's a place that it really is about promoting yourself. And we have a model of heavy self-promotion. I feel that as an author because so many friends are writing books, and I watch them go through that journey of like, how do I have enough of a public presence to get eyes on the work that I produced without constantly feeling like I'm trumpeting myself? And so you probably see examples in social media of women and men who are very self-promotional. And so it can look like, oh, this is what confidence looks like in the world. And I don't think that's the case. So you have to be able to kind of sort out what you see from the reality of your situation. And I think there's a huge piece in knowing yourself, and that certainly comes through, time of discernment with the Lord. But I think a community of friends are hugely helpful. I mean, you and I have talked about this over coffee or over meals. We have conversations about our own leadership and the struggles that we have. I was on vacation with a friend that's a nationally known women's leadership expert. And I did not expect to get coached on vacation in Nashville. Like, she offered me some helpful feedback. And I needed that conversation. I needed someone to mirror back times when I was diluting my confidence and my directness by how I communicated. And that was only possible by being in conversation with others. And so that's why I think this book is really helpful, is it sets the table for what I hope will be an ongoing meal for women, of getting the kind of feedback that encourages both humility and confidence.
That ties beautifully to the last section of the book, Joanna, which is pursue purposeful relationships. And one thing I appreciate about the book and what you're explaining today about how to use it is that not only are you saying that, you're modeling it, you just described it, and then you're hoping that this book actually generates that it generates conversation that leads to purposeful relationship. How have you found that? You just gave us one example, but how have you found that aspect, purposeful relationships, to be key to you being in this space, even for this long, and then encouraging other women who you encounter?
Yeah, one of the greatest gifts of this journey in faith and work has been the relational network that the Lord has built. And some of that, I think, is through my own intentionality. Like I've sought out meatier conversations with women. And so I think about the women or men who might be listening. And that's something you're able to do, but you maybe have to be the initiator to go there and set the table. That's why something like a book can be a helpful starting place if you don't know where to start. So I think the Lord has really blessed me with a community of relationships. And also like it's taking the conversation there. Like I went out to dinner for Indian food with a couple friends this weekend, and we were talking about managing our schedules. And it was an honest conversation. And I came away from it with 2 or 3 very practical solutions. We also were talking about at a heart level, like what in the world is leading us to overwork the way that we are, because it's an inner journey as well. And it was such a life-giving conversation to be able to have those types of settings where I can dig in with it. And I think now's the time to start building that. If you don't have that type of relationship in your life, lay the groundwork. It can take time for those relationships to build, but you can initiate. We specifically have a chapter in the book on mentoring because I find as I talk to younger career women, they're deeply hungry for mentors and don't know how to find them. And sometimes we have a limited understanding or tools to begin to get those types of rich relationships. We think it comes from finding the one person who's going to pour into you. We even use that metaphor, pouring into. And really, the goal is that you want to build a constellation of relationships that you're in dialogue with. And that's more freeing. It's open-ended towards the people that you engage with. So you may not be asking them to be your mentor, but you're graciously asking if they can help you give some input onto a struggle that you're having. And that's often the place it starts. Just a generous, open-ended invitation that's low pressure, and see if you can start a friendship and a conversation from that point. So we need to learn new skills of how to cultivate these relational networks because it's good for all of us. It's good for the kingdom.
Yeah. Absolutely. And if you can approach it that way, often, not always, but often it grows into the type of relationship where there's a real sort of reciprocity, like you're describing, that is so helpful. And over time, you do get to receive input that is so helpful. And on occasion, then give it if it's something that God is growing in you or that you've had experience in. And to your point about utilizing the book as a way to pursue that, I have done that. I mean, it was with a friend who I already know here at Fellowship, and we periodically pick a book and work through it together. And she is single, and work takes up, as you were describing, work is a large part of what she has to manage, what she has to be concerned about. And we had so many great conversations through using the Women Work and Calling book. So if some of our listeners want to pick up a copy of the book, or if some of the women listening want to participate in the Women Work and Calling initiatives, what are ways they can do that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The book is available on Amazon or at major online retailers. I have yet to see it in bookstores. So come on, Barnes & Noble, put it on the shelves, please. But it's available online. You can also learn more information about what we're doing at womenworkandcalling.com. And here's a couple resources. You know, we serve a local audience in Denver, and we serve a growing national and international audience. And so for those of you that may be listening outside of Denver, we have quarterly webinars where we explore themes related to women in work. We host an annual event, which will be November 1st. It's here in Denver, Colorado for women that are in Colorado, but it's also live streamed out around the country. We have host sites all over the country where women are gathering in groups to participate. Or you can watch online as an individual. We'll have online discussion groups to support you in that. So that's a way to do it. And we are continuing to roll out resources that help people. Like I said, you can get a digital discussion guide that goes along with the book at womenworkandcalling.com. Subscribe to our newsletter. But we're continuing to think about how can we get more resources into leaders and women's hands so that this is an ecosystem, I call it, of vocational discipleship. We're not starting a million women work and calling chapters around the country, but we're coming alongside the great work that's already happening to fill this gap, supplement it, provide resources and communities around whole life discipleship for women.
Well, Joanna, thank you for spending time on the podcast with me today. I am so grateful for you, for your friendship, and for all of the work that you're doing through the Women Work and Calling initiative, through the book. And for those of you listening, if you have any specific questions that we didn't cover today would be interested in connecting to Joanna or didn't catch some of that information at the end, you can email podcast@fellowshipdenver.org, and I'd be happy to send you the links to the sites that Joanna mentioned. We'll also post those in our notes for this podcast episode. But Joanna, thank you for spending time on the podcast with me today.
What a gift to be here. Thank you.
And as always, you can send feedback about today's episode, send your questions or suggestions to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam England for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.